Jedi Temperament. It seems best at this point to turn back for a moment from ethics to psychology, where a very important problem awaits us, a problem to which the Jedi have given a great deal of attention. What precisely is the relation between individual constitution and temperament on the one hand, and the kind and degree of spiritual knowledge on the other? The materials for a comprehensively accurate answer to this question are not available, except, perhaps, in the form of that incommunicable science, based upon intuition and long practice, that exists in the minds of experienced spiritual directors. However, the answer that can be given, though incomplete, is highly significant. All knowledge, as we have seen, is a function of being, or, to phrase the same idea in scholastic terms, the thing known is in the knower, according to the mode of the knower. In the introduction chapter to this book, reference was made to the effect upon knowledge of changes of being along what may be called its vertical axis, in the direction of sanctity or its opposite. But there is also variation in the horizontal plane. Congenitally, by psychophysical constitution, each one of us is born into a certain position on this horizontal plane. It is a vast territory, still imperfectly explored, a continent stretching all the way from imbecility to genius, from shrinking weakness to aggressive strength, from cruelty to Pickwickian kindliness, from self-revealing sociability to taciturn misanthropy and love of solitude, from an almost frantic lasciviousness to an almost untempted constitution. From any point on this huge expanse of possible human nature, an individual can move almost indefinitely up or down, towards union with the Force, or towards the last, the infernal extremes of separateness and selfhood. But where horizontal movement is concerned, there is far less freedom. It is impossible for one kind of physical constitution to transform itself into another kind, and the particular temperament associated with a given physical constitution can be modified only within narrow limits. With the best will in the world and the best social environment, all that anyone can hope is to make the best of their congenital psychophysical makeup. To change the most fundamental patterns of constitution and temperament is often beyond their power. In the course of the last 30 centuries, many attempts have been made to work out a classification system in terms of which human differences could be measured and described. For example, there is the ancient Hindu method of classifying people according to the psychophysico-social categories of caste. There are the primarily medical classifications associated with the name of Hippocrates, classifications in terms of two main habits, the physic and the apoplectic of the four humours, blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, and the four qualities, hot, cold, moist and dry. More recently, there have been the various physiognomic systems of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the crude and merely psychological dichotomy of introversion and extroversion, the more complete, but still inadequate, psychophysical classifications proposed by Kretschmer, Stockard, Viola, and others. And finally, the system more comprehensive, more flexibly adequate to the complex facts than all of those which preceded it, described by Dr. William Sheldon and his collaborators. In the present chapter, our concern is with classifications of human differences in relation to the problems of the spiritual life. Traditional systems will be described and illustrated, and the findings of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi will be compared with the conclusions reached by the most recent scientific research. In the West, the traditional Catholic classification of human beings is based upon the gospel anecdote of Martha and Mary. The way of Martha is the way of salvation through action. The way of Mary is the way through contemplation. Following Aristotle, who in this, as in many other matters, was in accord with the perennial philosophy of the Jedi, Catholic thinkers have regarded contemplation, the highest form of which is the unit of knowledge of the unmanifest force, as humanity's final end, and therefore have always held that Mary's was indeed the better way. Significantly enough, it is in essentially similar terms that Dr. Radin classifies and, by implication, evaluates human beings insofar as they are philosophers and religious devotees. For him, there is no doubt that the higher monotheistic forms of religion are created, or should one rather say with Plato, discovered, by people belonging to the first of the two great psychophysical classes of human beings, the people of thought. To those belonging to the other class, the people of action, is due the creation or discovery of the lower, unphilosophical, polytheistic kinds of religion. This simple dichotomy is a classification of human differences that is valid so far as it goes. But like all such dichotomies, whether physical, like Hippocrates' division of humanity into those of weak and those of vigorous habit, or psychological, like Jung's classification in terms of introvert and extrovert, this grouping of the religious into those who think and those who act, those who follow the way of Martha and those who follow the way of Mary, is inadequate to the facts. And of course, no director of souls, no head of a religious organisation is ever, in actual practice, content with this all too simple system. Underlying the best Catholic writing on prayer and the best Catholic practice in the matter of recognising vocations and assigning duties, we sense the existence of an implicit, an unformulated classification of human differences, more complete and more realistic than the explicit dichotomy of action and contemplation. In Hindu thought, the outlines of this more complete and adequate classification are clearly indicated. The ways leading to the delivering union with the force are not two, but three. The way of works, the way of knowledge, and the way of devotion. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna instructs Arjuna in all three paths: liberation through action without attachment, liberation through knowledge of the self and the unmanifest force with which it is identical, and liberation through intense devotion to the manifest force, or the divine incarnation. Quote,
"Do without attachment the work you have to do. For people who do their work without attachment attain the supreme goal verily. By action alone, people like a Janaka attain perfection."
unquote. But there is also the way of Mary. Quote,
"Freed from passion, fear, and anger, absorbed in the force, taking refuge in the force, and purified by the fires of knowledge, many have become one with the force."
unquote. And again, quote,
"Those who have completely controlled their senses and are of even mind under all conditions, and thus contemplate the imperishable, the ineffable, the unmanifest, the omnipresent, the incomprehensible, the eternal, they, devoted to the welfare of all beings, attain the force alone, and none else."
unquote. But the path of contemplation is not easy. Quote,
"The task of those whose minds are set on the unmanifest force is more difficult. For, to those who are in the body, the realization of the unmanifest force is hard. But those who consecrate all their actions to the manifest force, as a personal God or as a divine incarnation, who regard the manifest force as supreme realization, who trust the manifest force and meditate upon the force with single-minded concentration, for those whose minds are thus absorbed in the force, it becomes evermore the saviour from the world's ocean of mortality."
unquote. These three ways of deliverance are precisely correlated with the three categories, in terms of which Sheldon has worked out what is, without question, the best and most adequate classification of human differences. Human beings, he has shown, vary continuously between the viable extremes of a tripolar system, and physical and psychological measurements can be devised whereby any given individual may be accurately located in relation to the 3 coordinates. Or we can put the matter differently and say that any given individual is a mixture in varying proportions of 3 physical and 3 closely related psychological components. The strength of each component can be measured according to empirically determined procedures. To the 3 physical components, Sheldon gives the names of endomorphy, mesomorphy, and ectomorphy. The individual with a high degree of endomorphy is predominantly soft and rounded and may easily become grossly fat. The high mesomorph is hard, big-boned, and strong-muscled. The high ectomorph is slender and has small bones and stringy, weak, unemphatic muscles. The endomorph has a huge gut, a gut that may be more than twice as heavy and twice as long as that of the extreme ectomorph. In a real sense, his or her body is built around the digestive tract. The centrally significant fact of mesomorphic physique, on the other hand, is the powerful musculature, while that of the ectomorph is the oversensitive and, since the ratio of body surface to mass is higher in ectomorphs than in either of the other types, relatively unprotected nervous system. The endomorphic constitution is closely correlated with a temperamental pattern, which Sheldon calls viscerotonia. Significant among the viscerotonic traits are love of food and, characteristically, love of eating, love of comfort and luxury, love of ceremoniousness, indiscriminate amiability, and love of people. As such, they are more likely to suffer a fear of solitude and crave company, to express emotion uninhibited, to love the notion of childhood in the form of nostalgia towards one's own past and an intense enjoyment of family life, to crave for affection and social support, and to rely on support when in trouble. The temperament that is related to mesomorphy is called somatotonia. In this, the dominating traits are love of muscular activity, aggressiveness, and lust for power, indifference to pain, callousness in regard to other people's feelings, a love of combat and competitiveness, a high degree of physical courage, a nostalgic feeling not for childhood, but for youth, the period of maximum muscular power, and a need for activity when in trouble. From the foregoing descriptions, it will be seen how inadequate is the Jungian conception of extroversion as a simple antithesis to introversion. Extroversion is not simple. It is of 2 radically different kinds. There is the emotional, sociable extroversion of the viscerotonic endomorph, the person who is always seeking company and telling everybody just what they feel. And there is the extroversion of the big-muscled somatotonic, the person who looks outwards on the world as a place where they can exercise power, where they can bend people to their will and shape things to their heart's desire. One is the genial extroversion of the salesman, the Rotarian socializer, the liberal Protestant clergyman. The other is the extroversion of the engineer, who works off their lust for power on things, of the sportsman and the professional blood and iron soldier, of the ambitious business executive and politician, of the dictator, whether in the home or at the head of a state. With cerebratonia, the temperament that is correlated with ectomorphic physique, we leave the genial world of Pickwick, the strenuously competitive world of Hotspur, and pass into an entirely different and somewhat disquieting kind of universe, that of Hamlet and Ivan Karamazov. The extreme cerebrotonic is the over-alert, oversensitive introvert, who is more concerned with what goes on behind his eyes, with the constructions of thought and imagination, with the variations of feeling and consciousness, than with that of the external world, to which, in their different ways, the viscerotonic and the somatotonic pay their primary attention and allegiance. Cerebrotonics have little or no desire to dominate, nor do they feel the viscerotonic's indiscriminate liking for people as people. On the contrary, they want to live and let live, and their passion for privacy is intense. Solitary confinement, the most terrible punishment that can be inflicted on the soft, round, genial person, is, for the extreme cerebratonic, no punishment at all. For them, the ultimate horror is the boarding school and the barracks. In company, cerebratonics are nervous and shy, intensely inhibited, and unpredictably moody. It is a significant fact that no extreme cerebratonic has ever been a good actor or actress. Cerebratonics hate to slam doors or raise their voices, and suffer acutely from the unrestrained bellowing and tramplings of the somatotonic person. Their manner is restrained, and when it comes to expressing their feelings, they are extremely reserved. The emotional gush of the viscerotonic strikes them as offensively shallow and even insincere. Nor have they any patience with the viscerotonic ceremoniousness and love of luxury and magnificence. They do not easily form habits and find it hard to adapt their lives to the routines which come so naturally to somatotonics. Owing to their oversensitiveness, cerebratonics are often extremely, almost insanely sexual. But they are hardly ever tempted to drink alcohol, which heightens the natural aggressiveness of the somatotonic and increases the relaxed amiability of the viscerotonic. Alcohol merely causing them to feel ill and depressed. Each in their own way, the viscerotonic and the somatotonic are well adapted to the world in which they live. But the introverted cerebratonic is in some sort incommensurable with the things and people and institutions that surround them. Consequently, a remarkably high proportion of extreme cerebratonics fail to make good as normal citizens and average pillars of society. But if many fail, many also become abnormal on the higher side of the average. In universities, monasteries, and research laboratories, wherever sheltered conditions are provided for those with small guts and feeble muscles, do not permit them to eat or fight their way through the ordinary rough and tumble. The percentage of outstandingly gifted and accomplished cerebratonics will almost always be very high. Realizing the importance of this extreme, over-evolved, and scarcely viable type of human being, all civilizations have provided in one way or another for their protection. In light of these descriptions, we can understand more clearly the Bhagavad Gita's classification of paths to salvation. The path of devotion is the path naturally followed by the person in whom the viscerotonic component is high. Their inborn tendency to externalize the emotions they spontaneously feel in regard to persons can be disciplined and canalized so that a merely animal gregariousness and a merely human kindliness can be transformed into charity, devotion to the manifest force, and universal goodwill and compassion towards all sentient beings. The path of works is for those whose extroversion is of the somatotonic kind, those who, in all circumstances, feel the need to do something. In the unregenerate somatotonic, this craving for action is always associated with aggressiveness, self-assertion, and the lust for power. For the born kshatriya, or warrior ruler, the task, as Krishna explains to Arjuna, is to get rid of those fatal accompaniments to the love of action, and to work with regard to the fruits of the work in a state of complete non-attachment to self, which is, of course, like everything else, a good deal easier said than done. Finally, there is the way of knowledge, through the modification of consciousness, until it ceases to be ego-centered and becomes centered in and united with the force. This is the way to which the extreme cerebratonic is naturally drawn. Their special discipline consists in the mortification of their innate tendency towards introversion for its own sake, towards thought and imagination and self-analysis as ends in themselves, rather than as means towards the ultimate transcendence of fantasy and discursive reasoning in the timeless act of pure intellectual intuition. Within the general population, as we have seen, variation is continuous, and in most people, the three components are fairly evenly mixed. Those exhibiting extreme predominance of any one component are relatively rare, and yet, in spite of their rarity, it is by the thought patterns characteristic of these extreme individuals that theology and ethics, at any rate on the theoretical side, have been mainly dominated. The reason for this is simple. Any extreme position is more uncompromisingly clear, and therefore more easily recognised and understood, than the intermediate positions, which are the natural thought pattern of the person in whom the constituent components of personality are evenly balanced. These intermediate positions, it should be noted, do not in any sense contain or reconcile the extreme positions. They are merely other thought patterns added to the list of possible systems. The construction of an all-embracing system of metaphysics, ethics, and psychology is a task that can never be accomplished by any single individual, for the sufficient reason that they are an individual with one particular kind of constitution and temperament, and therefore capable of knowing only according to the mode of their own being. Hence, the advantages inherent in what may be called the anthological approach to truth. The Sanskrit Dharma is one of the key words in Indian formulations of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi, has two principal meanings. The Dharma of an individual is, first of all, their essential nature, the intrinsic law of their being and development. But Dharma also signifies the law of righteousness and piety. The implications of this double meaning are clear. A person's duty, how they ought to live, what they ought to believe, and what they ought to do about their beliefs. These things are conditioned by their essential nature, their constitution, and their temperament. Going a good deal further than do the Catholics with their doctrine of vocations, the Indians admit the right of individuals with different dharmas to worship different aspects or conceptions of the force. Hence, the almost total absence, among Hindus and Buddhists, of bloody persecutions, religious wars, and proselytizing imperialism. It should, however, be remarked that within its own ecclesiastical fold, Catholicism has been almost as tolerant as Hinduism and Mahayana Buddhism. Nominally one, each of these religions consists of a number of very different religions, covering the whole gamut of thought and behaviour, from fetishism through polytheism, through legalistic monotheism, through devotion to the sacred humanity of the Avatar, to the profession of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi, and the practice of a pure spiritual religion that seeks the unitive knowledge of the unmanifest force. These tolerated religions within a religion are not, of course, regarded as equally valuable or equally true. To worship polytheistically may be one's dharma. Nevertheless, the fact remains that humanity's final end is the unitive knowledge of the unmanifest force, and all the historical formulations of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi agree that every human ought, and perhaps in some way or other actually will, achieve that end. All souls, writes Father Garrigou Lagrange, receive a general remote call to the mystical life, and if all were faithful in avoiding, as they should, not merely mortal but venial sin, if they were, each according to their condition, docile to the force, and if they lived long enough, a day would come when they would receive the proximate and efficacious vocation to a high perfection, and to the mystical life properly so called. With this statement, Hindu and Buddhist theologians would probably agree, but they would add that every person will in fact eventually attain this high perfection. All are called, but in any given generation, few are chosen, because few choose themselves. But the series of conscious existences, corporeal or incorporeal, is indefinitely long, and there is therefore time and opportunity for everyone to learn the necessary lessons. Moreover, there will always be helpers, for periodically there are descents, of the unmanifest force into physical form, and at all times there are future Buddhas ready on the threshold of reunion with the intelligible light of the force to renounce the bliss of immediate liberation, in order to return as saviours and teachers again and again into the world of suffering and time and evil, until at last every sentient being shall have been delivered into eternity. The practical consequences of this doctrine are clear enough. The lower forms of religion, whether emotional, active, or intellectual, are never to be accepted as final. True, each of them comes naturally to persons of a certain kind of constitution and temperament, but the dharma or duty of any given individual is not to remain complacently fixed in the imperfect religion that happens to suit them. It is rather to transcend it, not by impossibly denying the modes of thought, behaviour, and feeling that are natural to them, but by making use of them, so that by means of nature they may pass beyond nature. Thus, the introvert uses discrimination in the Indian phrase, and so learns to distinguish the mental activities of the ego from the principal consciousness of the force, which is akin to or identical with the unmanifest force. The emotional extrovert learns to hate his father and mother. In other words, to give up his selfish attachment to the pleasures of indiscriminately loving and being loved, concentrates their devotion on the personal or incarnate aspect of the force, and comes at last to love the unmanifest force by an act no longer of feeling but of will illuminated by knowledge. And finally, there is that other kind of extrovert whose concern is not with the pleasures of giving or receiving affection, but with the satisfaction of their lust for power over things, events, and persons. Using their own nature to transcend their own nature, they must follow the path laid down in the Bhagavad Gita for the bewildered Arjuna, the path of work without attachment to the fruits of work, the path of what Saint François de Sales calls holy indifference, the path that leads through the forgetting of self to the discovery of the force. In the course of history, it has often happened that one or other of the imperfect religions has been taken too seriously and regarded as good and true in itself, instead of as a means to the ultimate end of all religion. The effects of such mistakes are often disastrous. For example, many Protestant sects have insisted on the necessity, or at least the extreme desirability, of a violent conversion. But violent conversion, as Sheldon has pointed out, is a phenomenon confined almost exclusively to persons with a high degree of somatotonia. These persons are so intensely extroverted as to be quite unaware of what is happening in the lower levels of their minds. If, for any reason, their attention comes to be turned inwards, the resulting self-knowledge, because of its novelty and strangeness, presents itself with the energy and quality of a revelation, and their metanoia, or change of mind, is sudden and thrilling. This change may be to religion, or it may be to something else, for example, to psychoanalysis. To insist upon the necessity of violent conversion as the only means to salvation is about as sensible as it would be to insist upon the necessity of having a large face, heavy bones, and powerful muscles. To those naturally subject to this kind of emotional upheaval, the doctrine that makes salvation dependent on conversion gives a complacency that is quite fatal to spiritual growth, while those who are incapable of it are filled with no less fatal despair. Other examples of inadequate theologies based upon psychological ignorance could easily be cited. One remembers, for instance, the sad case of Calvin, the cerebratonic, who took his own intellectual construction so seriously that he lost all sense of reality, both human and spiritual. And then there is liberal Protestantism, that predominantly visceratonic heresy, which seems to have forgotten the very existence of the Father, Spirit, and Logos, and equates Christianity with an emotional attachment to Christ's humanity, or, to use the currently popular phrase, the personality of Jesus, worshipped idolatrously as though there were no other aspect of the Force. Even within all-comprehensive Catholicism, we constantly hear complaints of the ignorant and self-centered directors who impose upon the people under their charge a religious dharma wholly unsuited to their nature, with results which writers such as St. John of the Cross describe as wholly pernicious. We see, then, that it is natural for us to think of the Force as possessed of the qualities which our temperament tends to make us perceive in it. But unless nature finds a way of transcending itself by means of itself, we are lost. In the last analysis, Philo is quite right in saying that those who do not conceive the Force purely and simply as the One injure not the Force, but themselves, and along with themselves, their fellows. The way of knowledge comes most naturally to persons whose temperament is predominantly cerebrotonic. By this I do not mean that the following of this way is easy for the cerebrotonic. Their specially besetting sins are just as difficult to overcome as are the sins which beset the power-loving somatotonic and the extreme viscerotonic, with their gluttony for food and comfort and social approval. Rather, I mean the idea that such a way exists and can be followed, either by discrimination or through non-attached work and one-pointed devotion, is one which spontaneously occurs in the cerebrotonic. At all levels of culture, they are the natural monotheists. And this natural monotheist, as Dr. Radin's examples of primary theology clearly show, is often a monotheist of the Tattvam Asi, inner light school. Persons committed by their temperament to one or other of the two kinds of extroversion are natural polytheists. But natural polytheists can, without much difficulty, be convinced of the theoretical superiority of monotheism. The nature of human reason is such that there is an intrinsic plausibility about any hypothesis which seeks to explain the manifold in terms of unity, to reduce apparent multiplicity to essential identity. And from this theoretical monotheism, the half-converted polytheist can, if they choose, go on through practices suitable to their own particular temperament, to the actual realization of the Force in their own and all other beings. They can, I repeat, and sometimes they actually do. But very often they do not. There are many theoretical monotheists whose whole life and every action prove that in reality they are still what their temperament inclines them to be, polytheists, worshippers not of the one Force they sometimes speak of, but of the many gods, nationalistic and technological, financial and familial, to whom in practice they pay all their allegiance. In Christian art, the Saviour has almost invariably been represented as slender, small-boned, unemphatically muscled. Large, powerful Christs are a rather shocking exception to a very ancient rule. Of Rubens' crucifixions, William Blake contemptuously wrote, quote,
I understood Christ was a carpenter and not a brewer's servant, my good sir.
Unquote. In a word, the traditional Jesus is thought of as a man of predominantly ectomorphic physique, and therefore, by implication, of predominantly cerebrotonic temperament. The central core of primitive Christian doctrine confirms the essential correctness of the iconographic tradition. The religion of the Gospels is what we should expect from a cerebrotonic, not of course from any cerebrotonic, but from one who had used the psychophysical peculiarities of their own nature to transcend nature, who had followed their particular dharma to its spiritual goal. The insistence that the abode of the Force is within, the ignoring of ritual, the slightly contemptuous attitudes towards legalism, towards the ceremonial routines of organised religion, towards hallowed days and places, the general otherworldliness, the emphasis laid upon restraint, not merely of overt action, but even of desire and unexpressed intention. The indifference to the splendours of material civilization, and the love of poverty as one of the greatest of goods. The doctrine that non-attachment must be carried even into the sphere of family relationships, and that even devotion to the highest goals of merely human ideals, even the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, may be idolatrous distractions from communion with the Force. All these are characteristically cerebrotonic ideas, such as would never have occurred spontaneously to the extroverted power lover or the equally extroverted viscerotonic. Primitive Buddhism is no less predominantly cerebrotonic than primitive Christianity, and so is Vedanta, the metaphysical discipline which lies at the heart of Hinduism. Confucianism, on the contrary, is a mainly viscerotonic system, familial, ceremonious, and thoroughly worldly. And in Islam, we find a system which incorporates strongly somatotonic elements. Hence, Islam's black record of holy wars and persecutions, a record comparable to that of later Christianity, after that religion had so far compromised with unregenerate somatotonia as to call its ecclesiastical organisation through the Church Militant. So far as the achievement of humanity's final end is concerned, it is as much of a handicap to be an extreme cerebrotonic or an extreme viscerotonic as it is to be an extreme somatotonic. But whereas the cerebrotonic and the viscerotonic cannot do much harm except to themselves and those in immediate contact with them, the extreme somatotonic, with their native aggressiveness, plays havoc with whole societies. From a certain point of view, civilization may be defined as a complex of religious, legal, and educational devices for preventing extreme somatotonics from doing too much mischief, and for directing their irrepressible energies into socially desirable channels. Confucianism and Chinese culture have sought to achieve this end by inculcating filial piety, good manners, and an amiably viscerotonic Epicureanism, reinforced somewhat incongruously by the cerebrotonic spirituality and restraints of Buddhism and classical Taoism. In India, the caste system represents an attempt to subordinate military, political, and financial power to spiritual authority, and the education given to all classes still insists so strongly upon the fact that humanity's final end is unitive knowledge of the Force that even at the present time, even after nearly 200 years of gradually accelerating Europeanization, successful somatotonics will, in middle life, give up wealth, position, and power to end their days as humble seekers after enlightenment. In Catholic Europe, as in India, there was an effort to subordinate temporal power to spiritual authority. But since the Church itself exercised temporal power through the agency of political prelates and mitred business people, the effort was never more than partially successful. After the Reformation, even the pious wish to limit temporal power by means of spiritual authority was completely abandoned. Henry VIII made himself, in Stubbs' words, the Pope, the whole Pope, and something more than the Pope. And his example has been followed by most heads of states ever since. Power has been limited only by other powers, not by an appeal to first principles as interpreted by those who are morally and spiritually qualified to know what they're talking about. Meanwhile, the interest in religion has everywhere declined, and even among believing Christians, the perennial philosophy of the Jedi has been to a great extent replaced by a metaphysic of inevitable progress and an evolving aspect of the Force, by a passionate concern, not with eternity, but with future time. And almost as suddenly, within the last quarter of a century, there has been consummated what Sheldon calls a somatotonic revolution, directed against all that is characteristically cerebrotonic in the theory and practice of traditional Christian culture. Here are a few symptoms of this somatotonic revolution. In traditional Christianity, As in all the great religious formulations of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi, it was axiomatic that contemplation is the end and purpose of action. Today, the great majority, even of professed Christians, regard action directed towards material and social progress as the end. An analytic thought, there is no question any longer of integral thought or contemplation, as the means to that end. In traditional Christianity, as in the other formulations of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi, the secret of happiness and the way to salvation were to be sought not in the external environment, but in the individual state of mind with regard to the environment. Today, the all-important thing is not the state of the mind, but the state of the environment. Happiness and moral progress depend, it is thought, on bigger and better gadgets and a higher standard of living. In traditional Christian education, the stress was all on restraint. With the recent rise of the progressive school, it is all on activity and self-expression. Traditionally, Christian good manners outlawed all expressions of pleasure in the satisfaction of physical appetites. You may love a screeching owl, but you must not love a roasted fowl. Such was the rhyme on which children were brought up in the nurseries of only 50 years ago. Today, the young unceasingly proclaim how much they love and adore different kinds of food and drink. Adolescents and adults talk about the thrills they derive from the stimulation of their sexuality. The popular philosophy of life has ceased to be based on the classics of devotion and the rules of modest conduct, and is now moulded by the writers of advertising copy, whose one idea is to persuade everybody to be as extroverted and uninhibitedly greedy as possible, since, of course, it is only the possessive, the restless, the distracted who spend money on the things that advertisers want to sell. Technological progress is in part the product of the somatotonic revolution, in part the producer and sustainer of that revolution. Indeed, extroverted attention results in technological advancement. Significantly enough, a high degree of material civilization has always been associated with the large-scale and officially sanctioned practice of polytheism. In their turn, technological discoveries have resulted in mass production, and mass production, it is obvious, cannot be kept going at full blast except by persuading the whole population to accept the somatotonic paradigm and act accordingly. Like technological progress, with which it is so closely associated in so many ways, modern war is at once a cause and a result of the somatotonic revolution. Nazi education, which was specifically education for war, had two principal aims: to encourage the manifestation of somatotonia in those most richly endowed with that component of personality, and to make the rest of the population feel ashamed of its relaxed amiability or its inward-looking sensitiveness and tendency towards self-restraint and tender-mindedness. During the Second World War, the enemies of Nazism were compelled, of course, to borrow from the Nazis' educational philosophy. All over the world, millions of young men and women are being systematically educated to be tough and to value toughness beyond every other moral quality. In such a system of somatotonic ethics, the idolatrous and polytheistic theology of nationalism flourishes. A pseudo-religion far stronger at the present time for evil and division than is Christianity, or any other monotheistic religion expounding unification and good. In the past, most societies tried systemically to discourage somatotonia. This was a measure of self-defense. They did not want to be physically destroyed by the power-loving aggressiveness of their most active minority, and they did not want to be spiritually blinded by an excess of extroversion. During the last few years, all this has changed. What, we may apprehensively wonder, will be the result of the current worldwide reversal of an immemorial social policy. Time alone will show.